Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we're meeting together to continue a tradition. Every year, for at least as long as I've been involved in the Focus program, so for about the last 7 years or so, the American Experiences and Visions of Freedom Focus clusters have had a combined meeting to celebrate Constitution Day. Constitution Day commemorates the formation and signing of the US Constitution on September 17th, 1787. And of course, September 17th is tomorrow, and today's Thursday, but we figure it's close enough. And actually, by meeting today, we're upholding Duke's legal obligation to celebrate Constitution Day. Since 2005, any school receiving federal funds is required under law to commemorate Constitution Day. For helping sponsor tonight's talk, we are thankful for the Arete Initiative of the Kenan Institute for Ethics, the Program in American Values and Institutions, and the Jack Miller Center. For our Constitution Day lecture, we choose a leading scholar of some aspect of the American political tradition. This year, we're privileged to have with us Professor Lucas Morel. Professor Morel is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and the head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He has special expertise on the political thought of Abraham Lincoln and Ralph Ellison, and he's published a number of books on these thinkers. He's the author of Lincoln and the American Founding and Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government. He's the editor of Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, and Ralph Ellison in The Raft of Hope, a political companion to the Invisible Man, as well as The New Territory, Ralph Ellison in the 21st Century. Dr. Morel is a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society. He's the former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a founding member of the American Academic Freedom Alliance, a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibitions on Lincoln and the Civil War, and he currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America. Tonight, he will be speaking to us on Lincoln, the founding, and an America worth saving. Before we welcome Professor Morel, a couple of words about tonight's format. Dr. Morel will speak for about 40 minutes. At the end of the lecture, we'll take 20 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. The Q&A feature on your Zoom webinar is enabled, and please submit your questions at any point in the lecture as soon as a question comes to mind. We'll curate these questions and we'll take as many as we can at the end of the talk. So now please join me in extending a warm Duke welcome to Professor Morel.
Thank you very much. I feel it all the way over here in Lexington, Virginia. Thank you, Professor Atkins and the Visions of Freedom Focus program at Duke University for the invitation to speak about Lincoln and the founding and what I call an America worth saving. Last year, I published a book by the title Lincoln and the American Founding. And I argue in that book that there was no greater influence on Lincoln's statesmanship than the leading men and especially the leading ideas that shaped America's revolution and constitutional formation. Simply put, if they had bumper stickers for the horse and buggy back in Lincoln's day, his carriage would say, "I heart the American founding." But the idea of getting right with the founders was not unique to Lincoln. In fact, the two main alternatives to the Republican Party, and of course, Lincoln as the presidential nominee during the 1860 campaign, and the ensuing secession winter, both alternatives appealed to the founders to justify their respective policies. Northern Democrats supported Lincoln's longtime rival, Illinois Senator Stephen Arnold Douglas. Douglas argued that our revolutionary fathers were indifferent regarding the future of slavery in America. Douglas claimed they endorsed something he called popular sovereignty, which permitted or banned slavery depending on the wishes of local white populations. He didn't think that his position as a US senator should have any influence, let alone any authority, regarding the spread of slavery into the federal territories. Southern Democrats rejected Douglas because he would not support a federal slave code for the federal territories to protect the right of slave owners to take chattel slaves out west. They went on to secede from the Union of American States drawing language from the Declaration of Independence in doing so, and then modeling the Confederate Constitution after the United States Constitution with some significant changes. James Thornwell of South Carolina, for example, insisted that secessionists were, quote, upholding the great principles which our fathers bequeathed and the very liberty for which Washington bled and which the heroes of the Revolution achieved. And so the election of 1860 was in a relevant sense a referendum on whose interpretation of the American founders was correct. Near the start of that election year, Lincoln exhorted Americans to have faith that right makes might. And he hoped to position the fairly new party, the Republican Party, as the true heirs of the founding. Now, you can't talk about the founding without talking about the founder, and that, of course, means George Washington. So in my book, I start with the influence that Washington had on Lincoln, Washington's character, his piety, and his indispensable role as a conceiver, a defender, and establisher of American self-government. But for Lincoln, more important than a founding man was a founding document, and that would be the Declaration of Independence. On the way to his first inauguration as president, Lincoln said that he had, quote, never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. So in chapter 2, the longest chapter of my book, I explore how Lincoln's political thought was shaped by key principles of the Declaration and to some extent, its chief draftsman, Thomas Jefferson. Now, if the Declaration spells out the purposes or ends of the American regime, chapter 3 of my book focuses on the means of American self-government. And these are found in the United States Constitution. I examine why Lincoln preached, quote, a reverence for the Constitution and laws, end quote, as well as the more perfect union of American states that the Constitution established. Of course, you can't read the Declaration and the Constitution and not notice where the Constitution fell short in certain places of the noblest aims of the Declaration. And so in chapter 4, I turn to what Lincoln learned from the founders' compromises with slavery, the institution that contradicted and undermined the founding experiment in self-government. My final chapter explains Lincoln's understanding of original intent as a political practice. In short, why follow the founders? This chapter examines how Lincoln understood his own respect for the American founding in light of progress, experience, and the responsibility of each generation to govern themselves under the Constitution, as Lincoln thought, in light of the ideals of the Declaration. Lincoln believed that during his contentious times, looking back to the founding could actually help Americans move forward. He did this most famously in his Gettysburg Address. That speech begins at the nation's beginning, fourscore and 7 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. If you do the math, you find that Lincoln takes his audience back not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration, not to the body, but to the soul, the heart of the nation. Lincoln goes on to explain that the Civil War was a test of America's purpose. As he put it, whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In the midst of a fight for the very survival of the United States, a civil war, Lincoln thought the nation would benefit from looking to its past. Americans needed a reminder of why the nation was founded in the first place, and therefore why preserving the Union of American States was so important. With Americans shooting not at a foreign enemy, but at each other, clearly there was some confusion about the meaning in their minds of America. This is why, as president-elect, he called Americans God's almost chosen people. Lincoln thought that Americans were undergoing something of an identity crisis. They were no longer united in their understanding of why their very nation existed. What were its highest aims and purposes? So in the middle of a fratricidal war Lincoln believed that only by returning to the original intentions and purposes of the founders could Americans recover their united or unified purpose as a free people. At Gettysburg, Lincoln exhorted Americans to recommit themselves, to dedicate themselves to the task that remained, to honor the dead who fought at Gettysburg on behalf of the Union by sustaining the effort to preserve the American Union. It was a fight to defend a certain political way of life, what Lincoln called government of the people, by the people, for the people. Recall that Lincoln delivered his short speech in the year of Jubilee, the year of emancipation. Union soldiers and sailors were now charged by the president to protect the freedom of over 3 million legally freed Black people. What Lincoln called a new birth of freedom was directly tied to the old, original birth of freedom, our first Emancipation Proclamation, the Declaration of Independence. Its central idea, that all men are created equal, described the natural condition of all human beings. So at Gettysburg, Lincoln did not announce a new principle of freedom, but affirmed an old one he learned from the founding fathers when they declared independence. Lincoln never sought to discover new rights for a new age. He never spoke of a living constitution, one where a visionary few would discern what the many would be benefited by. Instead, Lincoln spoke of the unfinished work to which the living, all of the American people, could dedicate themselves. In this way, they could honor the men who fought and died at Gettysburg, those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. This was no Civil War epiphany for Lincoln. In February of 1861, as he headed to the nation's capital to be inaugurated as president, he stopped in Trenton, the capital of New Jersey, and told the state Senate, "I am exceedingly anxious that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made. A nation devoted to the equal rights of every person is a nation worthy of the saving." Our temptation today is to think that everything new is by definition improved. But in Lincoln's time, there were some Americans arguing for something new, an improvement as they saw it over the American founders, which rejected what Lincoln considered the original idea of American independence. Consider Alexander Stephens of Georgia, a former Whig colleague of Lincoln's during Lincoln's sole term in Congress. As the vice president of the Confederate States of America, Stephens argued that their new Constitution was a better one than the old one Lincoln was trying to preserve. It was better not simply because it protected slavery by mentioning it explicitly, where the original Constitution never even used the word. There were plenty of regimes throughout human history that practiced slavery. That wasn't new with the Confederacy. But Stephens argued that the Confederacy was the first to base its slave society on a racial principle, white supremacy. Stephens said that the American founders believed that, quote, the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. However, he lauded the Confederate Constitution because it was, quote, founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, Stephens declared. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Stephens added, this our new government is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Stephens argued that the anti-slavery principles of the founding, quote, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races, end quote. He called this an error, a sandy foundation, unlike the new and improved Constitution he helped draft for the new Confederate States of America. Nevertheless, in the decade leading up to the Civil War, Lincoln's main political target was not slave-owning Southerners, but complacent white Northerners, especially those led by Senator Stephen Douglas. Lincoln criticized Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty because it was neutral on the slave question. He believed that whites at the local level, Douglas, whether in the states or federal territories, had the right to decide the question of slavery without interference from Congress. In other words, whether slavery would expand or diminish in the United States. Under Douglas's definition of popular sovereignty, this would be determined not by a majority of all American citizens, i.e., through Congress, but by a very small majority of the settlers who went to live in the Western territories. In reference to the enslavement of Black people out West, Stephen Douglas had said, "I don't care whether it be voted up or down." This indicated to Lincoln that the greatest obstacle to reducing slavery in the United States was Douglas teaching white Northerners to become indifferent to the plight of Black people in the federal territories. As Lincoln put it, they tell us that they desire the people of a territory to vote slavery out or in as they please. The question arises, slavery or freedom? Caring nothing about it, they let it come in. And that is the end of it. It is the surest way of nationalizing the institution, just as certain, but more dangerous because more insidious. But it is leading us there just as certainly and as surely as Jeff Davis himself would have us go. What made Douglas's don't care policy in the territories so insidious to Lincoln was that for slavery to become national, no politician north of the Mason-Dixon line needed to argue in favor of slavery. Following Douglas, simply get white Americans in the free states not to care if Black slavery expanded into federal territory. Once slavery was accepted as a constitutional right in the territory, it would soon become legal in the free states, regardless of what their laws or constitution said. In his debates with Douglas in 1858, Lincoln warned that popular sovereignty, coupled with the 1857 Dred Scott decision, would produce precisely this outcome in the not too distant future. Remarkably, in Illinois, where Blacks possessed few civil rights and no political rights, Lincoln consistently stood up for their possession of natural rights, where Douglas was emphatic in reading Blacks out of the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln believed it included Black people in principle, all people, everywhere. Tempted by Douglas to stray from its original commitment to human equality, America was becoming a country Lincoln no longer recognized. So he called upon our ancient faith, as he put it, to guide the country back to its noblest ideals and practices. Looking back to the founders couldn't have been more relevant to the crisis the nation faced in the 1850s. But appealing to the founders was something Stephen Douglas also did. He was not only Lincoln's nemesis, but also the leading Democrat and therefore the leading politician of the 1850s. He claimed that he knew better than Lincoln what the founders thought about the question of slavery. Douglas claimed that his policy aligned more closely with the founders' intentions for the new republic. In Lincoln's mind, the future of freedom and what he hoped would be the eventual demise of slavery depended on whose reading of the founders was correct and could best unite a divided country. Lincoln argued that at the founding of the United States, slavery was viewed and treated as a necessary evil, but it had become in the slaveholding states, to quote South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, a positive good. The founders also agreed that where slavery already existed in the states, Congress would have no authority over the institution because of the federal nature of the Constitution. Slavery was what was known as a domestic institution, and that meant it was governed mostly by state authority. Since the beginning of the United States, the powers of government were divided between the state governments and the national government. Because slavery existed prior to the formation of the United States, it remained a state institution. If the states themselves didn't abolish it, it could not be abolished by Congress, short of a constitutional amendment. With the population growing faster in the free states than in the slaveholding states, the future of slavery in America would be decided by the votes of white Northerners. Lincoln believed that Congress did have authority to ban slavery, but only in the land possessed by the American people at large, and that would be the federal territories. However, tempted by Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty, slavery's fate might be determined not by moral right, but by mere self-interest, meaning those who could profit by taking Black slaves into the territories. But if white Northerners agreed with Douglas that Congress did not have authority at all to regulate the domestic affairs of the federal territories, then his declared indifference would actually represent, in Lincoln's words, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. And so Lincoln was at pains to tie the future security of the rights of white people to the present insecurity of the rights of Black people. Those same white Americans would have to decide if what happened to people who did not look like them, enslaved Blacks in the South, potentially being taken out west, had anything to do with the kind of country in which they wanted to live. For Lincoln, the necessary connection could be found not only in the thinking, but also the practice of the American founders. So we take a case in point. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened both territories north of the 3630 parallel to the possibility of slavery, it contradicted the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which banned slavery from that very territory. Lincoln pointed out that the founding generation, as well as the generations that followed in the early republic, they acted to restrict the expansion of slavery in the United States. They did so by banning slavery from the Northwest Territory in 1787 and stopping the importation of slaves in 1808, all in hopes of putting slavery, as Lincoln put it, in the course of ultimate extinction. He lamented how the nation had departed from this original approach to abolishing the pre-existing institution of slavery in a peaceful, gradual manner. And these are his words. The plain, unmistakable spirit of that age towards slavery was hostility to the principle and toleration only by necessity. But now it is to be transformed into a sacred right. Nebraska brings it forth, places it on the high road to extension and perpetuity. Little by little, but steadily, as man's march to the grave, we have been giving up the old for the new faith. The new faith was Douglas's perversion of true, legitimate popular sovereignty. Douglas's was, in Lincoln's mind, a crude majoritarianism. It rejected the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and made the rights of Black people depend on the arbitrary will of local white majorities. Lincoln rejected this legal positivism, and he preached a return to what he called our ancient faith, the faith of the fathers. Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust, Lincoln declared. Let us repurify it. Let us turn and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the Revolution. Let us turn slavery from its claims of moral right back upon its existing legal rights and its arguments of necessity. Let us return it to the position our fathers gave it, and there let it rest in peace. Lincoln charged Americans to readopt the Declaration of Independence. In so doing, they would not only have saved the Union, but, as he put it, so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. That was October of 1854. A country worthy of the saving needed to be a country that limited the spread of slavery as a first step to its eventual extinction. In short, a don't care policy was not worthy of Lincoln's generation of Americans because it was not worthy of the fathers of the Republic. In December of 1860, President-elect Abraham Lincoln received a letter from none other than Alexander Stephens. He would soon become the Vice President of the Confederate States of America. Stephens wanted Lincoln to speak to the nation before his March 4th inauguration. In Stephens's words, to save our common country. Quoting Proverbs 25, Stephens suggested to Lincoln that, quote, a word fitly spoken by you now would be like apples of gold in pictures of silver. This prompted Lincoln to jot a note to himself, a reflection on what he called the philosophical cause of American prosperity. For someone who had long revered the Constitution and saw the union of the American states as essential to the success of the American Republic, Lincoln wrote that even these, the Constitution and the Union, are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. And then Lincoln alluded to the proverb that Stephens had cited. The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. What the country needed was not a new word from their new president, but old words, the words of their forefathers expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln saw that the Declaration's principle of liberty to all, the equal rights possessed by all human beings, he saw that as the moral compass of a constitution and union of states that could otherwise be misinterpreted or even broken in pursuit of tyrannical ends. A year before he was elected president, Lincoln was asked to give a speech in Boston upon the anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's birth. Lincoln could not make the trip, but he sent a letter that was essentially an ode to Jefferson's achievement in drafting the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln wrote that the principles of Jefferson are the definitions and axioms of free society. For someone who studied Euclid's geometry while in Congress, Lincoln was referring to the Declaration's principles as the building blocks of democracy. Unfortunately, even self-evident truths can be denied and evaded, as was the case when he wrote that letter praising Jefferson in 1859. Lincoln went on to say that this is a world of compensations, and he who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Alluding to Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, Lincoln observed, quote, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it." These were astonishing words for Lincoln, the Republican and former Whig, to utter, given the success that states' rights Democrats achieved in donning the mantle of Jefferson, one of the founders of the Democratic Party. Still, Lincoln declared, "All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days, it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression." In looking back to Jefferson, Lincoln looked back to a founding generation that put the principles of civil society and legitimate government in writing. Principles he believed applied in his day and obligated Americans to renew their commitment to eliminating slavery as fast as circumstances should permit. Lincoln's anti-slavery convictions were the very thing that informed his devotion to the Constitution. Like the founders, Lincoln believed that but for the American Union, there would be no freedom for whites or blacks. This was no innovation on Lincoln's part, but rather the abiding conviction of Americans who knew their colonial and revolutionary history. At that time, liberty required political independence from foreign powers. That independence required unity among the American colonies. To maintain that American unity required that compromises be made, especially regarding slavery. This is how Lincoln described it. I think that was the condition in which we found ourselves when we established this government. We had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties. Time and again, Lincoln's references to the founders centered on how they tried to establish a government based on human equality, but by that very equality imposed upon themselves a moral necessity, an obligation to abolish slavery in a manner consistent with the consent that, as I see it, was the flip side of the equality coin. As Lincoln put it late in the war, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. And yet, I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. This distinction between official duty and personal wish, a distinction Lincoln made most famously in his 1862 public letter to Horace Greeley before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, I think this distinction demonstrates most clearly Lincoln's concern that Americans follow the rule of law in their pursuit of justice. So with a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation basically in his pocket, Lincoln said to Greeley, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." In America, the means of securing liberty needs to be consistent with the end. To emancipate slaves as president in a time of war, Lincoln basically had to turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means. This way, emancipation would be not only an act of justice, but also an act, as he put it, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. Lincoln sought to make both his means and his ends a faithful expression of the consent of the American people. Lincoln made a correct view of the founding central to the nation's response to alternative interpretations promoted by influential figures such as Chief Justice Roger Taney and Senator Stephen Douglas. Unlike Lincoln, Taney and Douglas thought that the Declaration of Independence was true only for white people. They read it that way to protect the slaveholding founders from charges of hypocrisy. In 1857, Taney wrote in his Dred Scott opinion, "The enslaved African race were not intended to be included and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. For if the languages understood in that day would embrace them, the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. A year later, Stephen Douglas echoed this reading of the Declaration. He said if they included Negroes in that term, they were bound as conscientious men that day and that hour, not only to have abolished slavery throughout the land, but to have conferred political rights and privileges on the Negro and elevated him to an equality with the white man. The very fact that they did not shows that they did not understand the language they used to include any but the white race. To make profession and practice consistent at the American founding, thereby making the founders worthy of admiration by later generations, Tawney and Douglas interpreted the founders' profession in light of their practice. If the founders did not immediately free the slaves, then they must not have seen Africans as created equal to Englishmen or their descendants. In response to the Dred Scott opinion, Tawney's opinion, Lincoln commented on the equality principle stated in the Declaration of Independence. On his reading, the founders, quote, did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. Lincoln understood the founders not as hypocritical politicians, but as prudent revolutionaries. They recognized that circumstances, like British opposition and longstanding prejudice and practice, could impede their attempt to secure these rights. Furthermore, Lincoln pointed out that their inaction regarding Black slaves in their midst was no different than their inaction toward white citizens in America. As he put it, they did not at once or ever afterwards actually place all white people on an equality with one another. They meant simply to set up a standard maxim for free society, which could be familiar to all, revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence, augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. Put simply, the founding generation of Americans did not believe that they could both free themselves and free their slaves without hazarding the success of both their independence and their attempt at a new way of governing themselves. Lincoln's respect for the American founding, which established a new nation devoted to securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, recognized both the noble end to which that nation was founded and the prudent means adopted to achieve that end. Lincoln became the greatest defender of the founders, not merely because he fought successfully to preserve the American Union, but also because he explained why America was worth preserving, what they were fighting for. In looking to the founders, Lincoln believed Americans could learn the true principles of self-government and thus find common ground for promoting a common future as a truly free, self-governing people. Lincoln belongs to the ages as a teacher of profound lessons regarding the means and ends of American self-government, as well as the challenge of living as a free people. In Lincoln's speeches and writings, Americans today can learn how exceptional their country is, or at least can be, and therefore why Lincoln called the United States the last best hope of Earth. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Morel. That was great. And now we're going to have some time, about 20 minutes or so, for question and answer. So feel free to send in your questions on the chat. We have a couple already that we can sort of start with, but again, begin to think and formulate your questions and put them in the queue and the question and answer feature in the chat, and we'll get to them. So the first question that we'll use to kick off, which I think is, it actually came in before you got to sort of, a point in your talk that I think made this question really interesting. But the question has to do with the relationship between Lincoln's belief in human equality and whether it requires a religious basis. And I think, the point in your talk that I think really makes this an interesting question is when Lincoln, is referring to Jefferson self-evident truths as a geometric truth. Yeah. Which would seem to be sort of self-evident and necessary. But then he follows it up by saying, something like a just God, such a person cannot long endure given a just God. So it was interesting to hear those two things sort of juxtaposed. One would seem to be sort of, it's a natural truth that's self-evident that doesn't rely on religion, but yet then he brings in a religious perspective to anchor or reinforce that truth. So I wonder how you would answer that question.
That's a very astute question and observation that was made. And the juxtaposition is in fairness, not Lincoln's, it's Jefferson's. The allusion to Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia is an allusion to Query 18 entitled On Manners. In other words, what the effect of slavery was having, not on Black people in Virginia, but on the enslavers of Black people. And Jefferson goes on to say, essentially, we're teaching half of the citizens, and that's what he called them, half of the citizens to be despots or tyrants to the other half. And that other half are the slaves. Jefferson just, combines the slaves and the masters as one citizenry, interestingly enough. It's Jefferson that goes on to close that query by saying, I tremble when I consider that God is just, that his justice shall not sleep forever. It's Jefferson that brings God into the equation. So the man who actually drafted the Declaration, and with Franklin and Adams's help, came up with the expression of equality as all men are created equal, what Lincoln is referring to as almost a geometric axiom, a self-evident truth. That same man brings in the possibility that if the white enslavers in Virginia don't figure out a peaceful way to abolish slavery, that God might intervene, that divine superintendence would come in. In other words, if the slaves were to revolt, Jefferson concedes in the notes on the state of Virginia that God would not take his side, that he would take the side of the slaves. And so it's Jefferson himself, and not simply Lincoln, but I would say Lincoln is mimicking or emulating, modeling his own political prose and rhetoric after Jefferson by bringing in not only that which is self-evident to any reasoning human being, but reinforcing it with the idea that human beings are created beings, and therefore that God did not create any human being to be the natural ruler of anyone else. Let me just read a quick quote that I think is germane here. And this is a passage from a speech that Lincoln gave in 1858. So during that great senatorial campaign against Stephen Douglas in Illinois. And this is Lincoln. Speaking of the founders, this was their majestic interpretation of the economy of the universe, the justice of the Creator to his creatures, to the whole great family of man. In their enlightened belief, nothing stamped with the divine image and likeness was sent into the world to be trodden on and degraded and imbruted by its fellows. And so Lincoln draws on the Christian concept, the Jewish concept of the imago Dei, right? The image of God. What we would say today as when we use the phrase the dignity of every person. Well, the old-fashioned biblical, if you will, conception of that was imago Dei, that every human being is created in God's image, and that biblical principle of equality, if you will, is one that Lincoln was alluding to as well.
Well, thanks. That's great, and I do have a couple more questions, but I want to take one that kind of follows up on this a little bit, and I think it's pertinent to. As I mentioned before, we got live on the webinar that the Visions of Freedom are about to go on a trip to DC, and we'll view the monuments, and one of the monuments we'll view is the Lincoln Monument, and of course we'll see the second inaugural. there on,
left.
sort of the right-hand side. And of course, it's a very scripturally heavy speech. And there's quite a lot about the judgment of God there.
Yep.
And I wonder, and in particular, the Civil War, sort of reflecting the judgment of God. And this questioner wonders, I mean, the Union won the Civil War, and what would Lincoln have concluded about his theodicy had the North lost?
Wow. Yeah, and theodicy is the right word to describe the second inaugural address. Without God's judgment, there is no second inaugural address. Without God's judgment, and I would add, without God's mercy. Not enough is said about God's mercy. Lincoln's appeal to God's mercy in that ever important third paragraph. Certainly the war, Lincoln supposes, he doesn't know that this is what God is doing, right? Because he says, the crux of the speech, the pivot, the fulcrum, is the Almighty has his own purposes. And it's only after Lincoln says that he goes on to suppose. It's like a political Godonkin experiment, right? He's like, let's try this. Maybe this explains what we just went through for 4 years. And then what does he do? He says, this is what Black people in America have been experiencing, not for 4, not for 40, but for 250 years, as he puts it, of unrequited toil. In other words, their labor and lives were stolen from them, not for 4 years. So for the whites who have experienced so much death and devastation as a result of 4 years, Lincoln tries to show how 4 years is actually a pretty short amount of time given what's been happening through American slavery for such a long time. And so what he does is he says, look, the Civil War might just very well be what he calls a scourge, right? An instrument of punishment for American slavery, not Southern slavery. Slavery was something that was the product of America, and America was the beneficiary, not just the South. But he says that if God wills that it continue, right, we would still see God as just. But the war looks like it's not going to continue. And so what the third paragraph is actually showing, Lincoln, I think, says, is that God is actually being merciful. That's only 600 or 700,000 men have died. Lincoln puts it in the context of 250 years of enslavement on American soil, which of course antedates even the formation of the United States. So you can't get to with malice toward none in charity for all without that. In some, and this is my interpretation in the germ of the second inaugural, what Lincoln is essentially saying is, you who believe in the same Bible and pray to the same God, even though you're on opposing sides, I've just laid out to you both an Old and New Testament depiction of God that you would see as just. If you claim to believe in this God, you should start now, start acting like him. If God can be merciful to you, his creation, surely you can be merciful to each other. That was the only hope Lincoln saw for true restoration of federal authority over the states and true reconciliation or reconstruction of the American Republic. This is my long windup to answering that question of speculation. Had the Union lost, obviously Lincoln would not have rendered this interpretation at that moment, and of course you probably would have had a different president. Lincoln's theodicy, I mean, for those who don't know what that term means, theodicy is literally in the Greek God's justice. And how do you have evil if there's a good God? Why do evil things or bad things happen? And Lincoln set the bar for him very high for this second inaugural address that Frederick Douglass said sounded more like a sermon than a state paper. Had the Union lost, had Lincoln failed as commander-in-chief, well, let's put it this way. There were others who thought that the war was also divine judgment. Those in the South who understood the war as divine and within God's providence, and they lost. They didn't change their mind about slavery. What they argued was that they did slavery badly, if you can believe it. In other words, God wasn't punishing us for a bad thing. He was punishing us for the ill use of a good thing. So they came up with a way to torture the Bible to defend even their own loss in that war. What would Lincoln have done? I think he would not have tried to figure out, he would not have interpreted the war simply as God's judgment, because clearly the judgment was that we were weighed and found wanting. So that if anything, you might say, and here I'm really reaching or stretching, Lincoln might have said, well, if it is God's judgment, guess what he's saying? America, an America that cannot emancipate in a time of peace and is unable to defend a country committed to that ultimate extinction of slavery in a time of war. If we fail at that, then we cannot justifiably call ourselves God's chosen people, or almost chosen people. He might have understood the loss in wartime as judgment on our capacity to make good use of freedom. I mean, we're right back where Jefferson was. He said, Lincoln said that those who say freedom for me and not for thee, we cannot long retain it. In 1838, I'll close with this, at least on this question. Lincoln said, as a nation of free men, we will either live forever or die by suicide. And so what he says, as I mentioned in my speech, was a test. The Civil War was testing whether a free people can actually live generation after generation with a responsible moral use of their freedom. The Civil War might well have demonstrated that free people were not capable of doing so if they were unable to rid themselves of the grand contradiction of freedom, which is slavery. So we would have been weighed and found wanting, and God would have moved on, maybe to some other country that could really put the Declaration of Independence to use. In short, I would not think that Lincoln would see that as a judgment that our principles were false. I think he would see it as a judgment that we were not capable of living up to our professions.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a really rich answer. And in addition to our field trip, there's another class that's going to be reading the inaugural in the upcoming weeks. So this is wonderful to spend some time reflecting on that. Thank you.
Great question.
Here's a question turning from religion to sort of constitutionalism. And this student once says, Lincoln is a clear constitutionalist, as you mentioned in your talk, and also a revivalist of the Declaration, and has great respect for Jefferson's ideals. However, Jefferson's idea that the Constitution naturally expires at the end of 19 years seems contrary to Lincoln's idea of the timeless nature of the Constitution. How can these two leaders differ on such a central issue? This question.
Yeah, well, one, we're taking at face value Jefferson's claim that that we need to be, what is it, we need to be watered by the blood every so many years. I don't know how serious to take Jefferson's claim that we need to start over every 19 years. I don't know that was something that he said 19 years after he was president. The nation continued. He was worried during the Missouri Compromise of 1820, a very famous letter to that effect to John Holmes, where he talks about slavery still persisting in the United States. We have the wolf by the ears. We can neither hold on to him nor let him go. Justice on the one hand for the slaves and self-preservation on the other for the white enslavers. And so I would first say I would take that statement of Jefferson's with a huge, with a boulder of salt. But more importantly, when it comes to Lincoln, there were several things that in Jefferson's mind, in terms of, in particular, slavery, how to produce the ultimate extinction of slavery, that Lincoln actually emphatically disagreed with. Jefferson believed in this so-called dispersion or dispersal or dilution approach, whereas Lincoln thought Congress did have authority to ban slavery's expansion into the territories. Jefferson thought the opposite. Even though he originally drafted that Article 6 of Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, Jefferson thought that it was up to, that Congress should have no role in resolving the Missouri crisis by saying Missouri can't come in as a slave state. He thought that was highly problematic. But Jefferson in that letter went on to say that if we want emancipation to take place, we have to make it safe for white people to do so. And he said the only way to do that is to emancipate and expatriate, which is to say we need to expel them. They need to leave the Commonwealth of Virginia or any other slaveholding state. And the most likely thing to do would be what Edward Coles, who knew Jefferson, was Madison's secretary or something to that effect. Edward Coles was a white slave owner in Virginia, and he was conscience bound to free his slaves, and they could not remain in Virginia. And so what he had to do is he moved out to the Western Territory with his slaves, and he set them up on farms. Edward Coles became, I believe, the first governor of a territory that eventually became the state of Illinois. And he became a leader of the debate in their constitutional convention to ensure that a free territory of Illinois would come in as a free state. There was a cohort of political movers and shakers in Illinois that wanted it to be a slave state. There were holdovers from the French occupation. There were slaves that were grandfathered in, and it took a guy like Edward Coles, as well as allies, to make sure that Illinois would stay free. And so Jefferson was very pessimistic about the peaceful coexistence of blacks and whites in Virginia, given what slavery would naturally lead the enslaved to think about their enslaver, right? 10,000 recollections on the part of the blacks, as he says. Odds are the first thing on their to-do list would be to seek vengeance. And Jefferson understood that to be a just impulse, and therefore the self-preservation on the part of the whites is going to prevent that from happening. The only way to try to make it more conducive for emancipation is to make it less threatening for whites to do so. And that means, again, here's the difference with Lincoln. Lincoln thought, no, we don't want it to spread and we don't want it to come in anymore. We'll get it to wither on the vine. Jefferson said, no, without importing anymore, we can release the pressure by letting the slaves go out west. That'll dilute the population of blacks versus whites, and whites will, Jefferson argued in subsequent generations, would feel less fear of reprisal if they were to wean themselves off of this coerced labor and eventually manumit them. So there were several things that Lincoln disagreed with Jefferson. The question is, politically, where did Lincoln direct the nation's gaze publicly to draw resources that he thought could both preserve the Union and be put us back on course of ultimately extinguishing slavery? He thought Jefferson would be useful for that, and argued consistently on that basis. But he didn't draw our gaze to all of Jefferson. That's why I said that he really looked to the Declaration and in part to its chief draftsman, Thomas Jefferson.
Thank you. We have two questions, and so it's almost 7:30, so I think we'll handle these last two questions, and I think they kind of complement each other, and we'll maybe open up an interesting line of conversation on which to conclude. And the first question this questioner asks, let's go ahead and read it. Do you think Lincoln's hesitancy about the idea of full, quote, social equality of blacks was an inconsistency in his explanation of human equality, or perhaps it reflects a limitation of the bare bones theory of natural rights that he had in mind, or perhaps it's due to something else?
When he was most full-throated about not being in favor of complete social and political equality with blacks is during his debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858. And most particularly, I believe it was the fourth debate at Charleston, where his most explicit statements along those lines were uttered. The best way to understand those is in light of what was uttered by Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was a rank, categorical white supremacist. How much so? Example, he said over and over in those debates that America was founded on the white basis. He was just like Tony, it was founded by whites, in favor of whites forever. So he out George Wallace, right? It wasn't segregation today, it was white supremacy today, tomorrow, and forever. On Christmas Eve, after Lincoln was elected, the November election on Christmas Eve, Douglas proposed two amendments to the Constitution, what would have been our 13th and 14th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, the first sentence was not going to say anything about natural born citizens, due process, equal protection, or privileges or immunities. The first clause of Douglas's 14th Amendment said that no Black person or person of mixed race, mulattoes, etc., no Black person could vote in any election in the United States at the municipal, state, federal, or territorial level, and no Black person could hold office at any state, federal, municipal, or federal territorial level. So that's what white Illinoisans were hearing. In the state of Illinois, by 1858, Black people, it was illegal for a Black person to immigrate to Illinois. I mean, that's just an outright unconstitutional law passed by the state of Illinois. It contradicted the Constitution's Privileges and Immunities Clause, but they, Indiana, the territory of Oregon, passed laws banning the immigration of Blacks into Illinois. Blacks couldn't vote, they couldn't serve on juries where a white was a defendant, and they certainly couldn't serve in the militia. So why did I tell you all this? That is the state of public opinion broadly understood in Illinois. So that's the material Lincoln has to go with. He doesn't have the luxury of appealing to a 21st century Duke University student population. Oh my goodness, for if that were true, right? Lincoln had to deal with a citizenry in a free state that was pervasively racist. There were abolitionists, but they were in the minority. They were a fringe, and Black people numbered less than 10,000 in the state of Illinois. So how does Lincoln counter the categorical white supremacy, the color bigotry of a Stephen Douglas, who is the leading politician and the odds-on favorite to become president in 2 years? He had to say, I'm not in favor of a policy that would immediately be a non-starter, dead on arrival if I were to become US Senator. In fact, it's irrelevant to the Senate. It's a state matter, not federal, which Lincoln pointed out. But what's important for Lincoln is he says, on the one hand, I agree, I am not in favor of doing everything possible to make Blacks politically equal to whites. In other words, he was just dealing with the reality of a bigoted population. But here's the interesting thing. In a state where Blacks could not vote, he consistently brought up the fact that Black people had natural rights. Why do that? Lincoln understood, unless I can shore up the conviction among white people that the basis of their rights is not their race or ethnicity, or even their nationality, that the basis of the rights of white people was not in this, but in this. In other words, their humanity. Unless I can shore that up, asking for the vote for Black people is a suicide mission, politically speaking. So what you see Lincoln doing is he's trying to pursue as much justice as he can gain majority consent for. For me, that is the mark of statesmanship. Not asking for the impossible, knowing you can't get it, but at least you'll be morally pure and have the moral high ground. No, if you want to get things accomplished in politics, you have to be prudent. And what we see is Lincoln's prudence on display there. I don't believe we see his racism. It would take, that's a whole other speech I can give you. Invite me back. But what we see there is Lincoln trying to shore up these, these dying embers, right? This is a population, as I say, that is being tempted by Douglas not to care about people that don't look like them. And Lincoln says, don't you realize that today you will be, arbitrating away the rights of Black people, but tomorrow it'll be Catholics. And the day after that, who knows? In other words, I hope you're in the majority, because in one of these days, if you're in the political minority, what have we just done? We've set up a precedent that says the only rights that deserve to be protected are those that the majority dictates are so. And Lincoln said in this country, and he learned this from Jefferson's first inaugural address, that yes, the majority has authority to rule, but for that rule to be reasonable, It has to protect the rights of the minority.
Well, thank you for that answer. And, in some ways it actually answers the final question, which was actually about the difference between, you mentioned that Lincoln saw the founders as prudent revolutionaries,
Yes.
But yet he also critiqued Northern white indifference.
Yes.
And so the question was, did Lincoln tackle the difference between prudence and complacency? And in some ways, the last example that your answer to that was an example of how he would respond to the difference between prudence, which might not get, go all the way, but a complacency that makes no effort at all and is completely indifferent.
Yeah, if I can add real quickly about the complacency part, Lincoln made a point of spelling that out to the Illinois population. He said, with Douglas, and then he also lambasted the Democratic Party of Douglas's day. He said, with Douglas and the Democrats, you have a party who isn't even attempting to help us to rise up to the noblest expression of our ideals. It is taking an existing bigotry, which today is on the basis of race, and we know there was nativism as well, anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic, you name it. There was plenty of that to go around, but the predominant one was race. Lincoln says, good grief, with the Democratic Party, you have a party that is not even attempting to get people to raise their moral horizons, as it were. And he pointed to the Republican Party, at least, which was a very new party. He pointed to the Republican Party and he said, at least with them, they, like the founders, at least understood that slavery in principle was unnatural, wrong, contrary to the Creator's design for human beings. And let's at least take some steps towards ridding ourselves of what he called the great behemoth of danger. He says, this is the only thing that has ever threatened our self-governing way of life from perpetuating itself. He says, we have got to find ways to get to extract ourselves, to extricate ourselves from being a slave-holding republic, which is a contradiction in terms, not shore up our prejudices. And so he really made that a front burner issue in a campaign, again, where he's not going to get a single black vote because they're not allowed to vote.
Well, thank you for just a wonderful, for that answer, a great Q&A and a wonderful talk. There's a lot of downsides to Zoom, but this Zoom webinar has two upsides. One is that we were able to go on for an extra 8 minutes, so we were able to get to a few more questions. But the second upside is we now have a ready-made excuse to invite you physically to come join us here at Duke. We'd love to have you. Well, everyone, why don't you join me? I know Professor Morel can't see you, but at least sort of join me in spirit and applaud him for a job well done.
Thank you all. Appreciate you taking the time.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.